coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but the man in the corner booth hadn't moved to ask for more. In a place like Callahan's Diner, where everybody knew everybody and silence itself felt like rudeness, a stranger who didn't speak was the worst kind of ghost. It was 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon in October 1971, and the lunch rush had thinned to just the regulars. Hank Miller nursing his third refill at the counter, old Mrs. Kowalski picking at a slice of apple pie, and the man nobody remembered inviting in. He sat hunched in booth 7, the torn vinyl cushion sighing beneath his weight every time he shifted. His coat, some threadbare thing that might have been navy once, hung loose on his frame like borrowed skin. Grease from the kitchen mingled with the bitter tang of burnt coffee and the faint sweetness of pie crust. But the man didn't seem to notice any of it. Margaret Maggie Brennan wiped down the counter for the 4th time that shift, her bleach-raw hands moving in practiced circles. 23 years old, auburn hair pinned back with bobby pins that never quite held, she'd been working at Callahan's since she was 16. The diner was all she knew. Her mother had worked here before her, back when old Jack Callahan himself still manned the grill. Now it was just Maggie, the cook Louise, and whoever happened to drift through the door. "You gonna check on him?" Louise called from the kitchen window, nodding toward booth 7. Maggie glanced over. The stranger's head was bowed, his face hidden beneath the brim of a hat that had seen better decades. "He hasn't asked for anything. He's been sitting there 2 hours. Maybe he's waiting for someone." But even as she said it, Maggie knew better. People who were waiting looked at the door. This man looked at nothing at all. She grabbed the coffee pot anyway, muscle memory really, and crossed the black and white checkered floor. Her shoes squeaked with each step. Up close, she could see the way his collar was frayed, the way dirt had worked itself into the creases of his knuckles. He smelled like rain and old tobacco and something else she couldn't place. Something sad. "Can I warm that up for you?" He didn't answer right away. Then, slowly, he lifted his head. His face was weathered in the way that comes from years outdoors. Deep lines carved around pale blue eyes that seemed to hold more exhaustion than any man should carry. He couldn't have been older than 50, but he wore age like a coat 3 sizes too big. "No thank you, miss." His voice was quiet, polite, almost apologetic. "Just the check, please." Maggie pulled the slip from her apron pocket, 1 cup of coffee, 35 cents, and set it on the table. The man reached into his coat and withdrew a wallet so worn the leather had split along the fold. As he opened it, something slipped out and fluttered to the table. A photograph. Black and white, edges soft with age. Before Maggie could stop, herself. She was looking at it. 2 boys, maybe 10 and 12, standing in front of a building she recognized instantly. Callahan's Diner, 1940-something, judging by the cars in the background. The older boy had his arms slung around the younger one's shoulders, both of them grinning like they'd just gotten away with something. Behind them, painted fresh on the window glass, "Grand Opening." Maggie's breath caught. She knew that photograph, or rather, she knew a copy of it, the one that hung behind the register, yellowed and curling at the corners. The older boy was Jack Callahan, the diner's founder, her grandfather, but the younger boy. "Who are you?" The words came out sharper than she intended. The man's hand trembled as he retrieved the photo, tucking it carefully back into his wallet. When he looked up at her, those pale eyes were glistening. "Nobody important, miss, just someone passing through." But Maggie was already moving, her heart hammering against her ribs. She crossed back to the register, yanked open the drawer beneath it, and pulled out the framed photograph that had hung there since before she was born. She brought it back to the booth and held it beside his wallet, which he'd left open on the table. Same photograph, same two boys, same diner. "That's my grandfather," Maggie whispered, pointing to the older boy. "Jack Callahan. He died 3 years ago." The man closed his eyes. A single tear traced the dirt line on his cheek. "I know." The diner seemed to hold its breath. Even the clatter from the kitchen had gone quiet. "The other boy," Maggie continued, her voice barely audible now. "Who is he?" The man opened his wallet wider. Tucked behind the photograph was a tattered birth certificate. The ink faded but still legible. Thomas James Callahan. Born June 7, 1933. Brother, John Patrick Callahan. The coffee pot slipped from Maggie's hand and shattered across the floor. But she didn't hear it. She was staring at the man in the corner booth, at his pale blue eyes, the shape of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, and seeing her grandfather's face reflected back at her through 30 years of absence. Thomas Callahan. The brother nobody talked about. The one who'd left town before Maggie was born and never came back. Until now. Before we go any further, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. And if you're already hooked by Tommy's story, hit that like button and subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. The silence stretched like taffy, thick and impossible to break. Because some secrets don't just hide in closets. They reshape entire families around their absence. Maggie stood frozen beside the booth, fragments of coffee pot glittering around her feet like scattered stars. Her mind was racing through every family story she'd ever heard, every half-finished sentence that ended when she walked into a room. She'd always known there was someone missing from the family tree, a blank space where a name should be. But asking about it had felt like pressing on a bruise nobody wanted to acknowledge. Tommy. The word came out like a prayer, like an accusation. The man, her uncle, she realized with a jolt that traveled from her chest to her fingertips, looked up at her with those Callahan blue eyes. The same shade as her mother's. The same shade she saw in the mirror every morning. "I go by Thomas now," he said quietly. "Haven't been Tommy in a long time." Luis appeared from the kitchen, dish towel in hand, surveying the broken glass. But when he caught the expression on Maggie's face, he simply nodded and began sweeping without a word. The old man at the counter had turned to watch, and Mrs. Kowalski's fork had stopped halfway to her mouth. "Why?" Maggie's voice cracked on the single syllable. "Why now? Why after all these years?" Thomas ran a trembling hand across his jaw. The gesture was so familiar it hurt. Her grandfather had done the exact same thing when he was thinking, when words felt too heavy to lift. "Because I'm dying," he said simply, "and I needed to see it one more time. The place Jack built, the life he made." The diner tilted slightly. Maggie gripped the edge of the table. "Sit down, mija," Luis murmured, pulling out the opposite bench. She sank into it without meaning to, her legs suddenly unreliable. Thomas watched her with an expression that might have been guilt, or might have been grief, or maybe there was no difference anymore. "Your mother," Thomas began, then stopped, started again. "Mary Catherine. She'd be, 42 now?" 43. Maggie's throat felt raw. "She doesn't live here anymore. Moved to Pittsburgh after Grandpa died." Something crossed Thomas's face. Relief or regret, impossible to tell. "And you stayed." Someone had to. The words came out harder than she meant them to. Someone had to keep this place running. Grandpa Jack built it from nothing, and when he got sick, She stopped, surprised by the sudden burn behind her eyes. I couldn't let it go under. Thomas nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. That's the Callahan way. We hold on too tight or let go completely. There's never been an in-between for us. Which one were you? The question hung between them like smoke. Thomas pulled the photograph from his wallet again, handling it with the careful reverence of someone holding something sacred. Jack and I used to dream about this place when we were kids. Back then, it was just Pop's garage. He fixed tractors, kept the farmers running. But Jack, he had this vision. A real restaurant. White tablecloths, proper coffee, pies that people would drive across the county to taste. His voice grew softer. He wanted to call it Callahan Brothers. The hurt in those last two words was so raw that Maggie had to look away. What happened? She asked, though part of her already knew. Part of her had always known, in the way children understand family grief before they have words for it. Vietnam. Thomas said the word like it was a stone he'd been carrying in his chest. 1968, I enlisted. Jack begged me not to, said we were finally getting somewhere, that we'd saved almost enough to put a down payment on this building. He gestured around the diner with a hand that shook. But I was 19 and stupid and convinced I was going to be a hero. Outside, a truck rumbled past on Route 30, its engine coughing black smoke. When I came back, Thomas continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. I wasn't the same person. Couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight, couldn't stand to be around people without feeling like the walls were closing in. Jack tried to help. God, he tried. But I was drowning, and every time he reached for me, I pulled us both under. Maggie thought about the bottle of whiskey her grandfather had kept in the desk drawer, the one he'd never touched, but never thrown away either. The way he'd sometimes stare out the window at nothing for hours. The photograph he'd kept by the register for 30 years. Waiting. So you left. I ran. Thomas corrected. Took off one night without a word. Figured Jack was better off without me dragging him down. He had Mary, and she was pregnant with you, and everything was finally working out the way he'd dreamed. I thought I was doing him a favor. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. The words came out before Maggie could stop them, but Thomas didn't flinch. If anything, he smiled, small and sad and utterly defeated. Yeah, he agreed. It was. Mrs. Kowalski had given up all pretense of eating and was openly listening now, her weathered face soft with something like pity. Hank Miller had turned his stool around completely. Even Luis had stopped sweeping, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, a community holding its breath. Did he try to find you? Maggie asked, though she already knew the answer. She'd seen the letters in her grandfather's desk after he died. Dozens of them, addressed to old Army buddies, VA hospitals, shelters in Philadelphia and Baltimore and D.C., all returned unopened or marked addressee unknown. I made sure he couldn't. Thomas's voice broke. Changed my name, moved every few months, stayed off any grid I could avoid. I was so convinced that disappearing was the kindest thing I could do. He looked up at her, and his eyes were red-rimmed. I didn't know he died until 6 months after the funeral. Saw it in an old newspaper someone had left at a bus station. Maggie's hands had curled into fists without her realizing it. All those years, all that grief her grandfather had carried, that her mother had inherited, that had somehow worked its way into Maggie's own bones. And for what? Because one broken man had decided his family was better off without him? But looking at Thomas now, at the way his shoulders curved inward like he was trying to make himself smaller, at the tremor in his hands that never quite stopped. She saw something else, too. She saw how loneliness could hollow a person out from the inside, and she understood, with a clarity that hurt, why her grandfather had never taken down that photograph. "You should have come back sooner," she said finally. Thomas nodded. "I know. He never stopped looking for you." "I know that too." Outside, the October wind picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. And in that corner booth at Callahan's diner, a family that had been broken for 30 years began, just barely, to remember how to fit back together. But what Maggie didn't know yet was that Thomas's wallet held more than just an old photograph. Thomas's fingers moved to a second pocket in the wallet, one hidden behind a fold of cracked leather. Because some men carry their entire lives in their pockets, waiting for the right moment to lay them down. Maggie watched as he withdrew a small envelope, the kind that might have once been white but had yellowed to the color of old piano keys. It was sealed with tape that had long since lost its stick, held closed now only by habit and the careful way Thomas handled it. "There's something else," he said, his voice so quiet that Maggie had to lean forward to hear him over the hum of the refrigerator units. "Something I need you to have." He slid the envelope across the table. Maggie stared at it like it might bite. "What is it?" "Open it." Her hands were steadier than she expected as she lifted the flap. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded in thirds. When she opened it, she recognized her grandfather's handwriting immediately. That careful, slanted script he'd used for the daily specials board, for birthday cards, for the letters he'd written to Thomas that never found their destination. "Last Will and Testament of John Patrick Callahan," the header read, dated March 15th, 1968. "I don't understand," Maggie whispered. "Grandpa's will was read after he died. Mom and I were there. There was the diner, some savings bonds, the house on Maple Street. That was the will he filed in '69. Thomas interrupted gently. "After he'd given up hope I'd ever come back. This one is from before I left. Before Vietnam. Before everything fell apart." Maggie's eyes scanned the document, her heart picking up speed. The language was formal but simple, written in her grandfather's own hand and notarized by someone named Harold Pritchard, the old lawyer who'd had an office above the hardware store until he retired in the '70s. "To my brother Thomas James Callahan, I leave equal partnership in Callahan's diner, to be shared and operated jointly as we always dreamed." The words blurred. Maggie blinked hard, forcing them back into focus. Should Thomas predecease me or be unable to claim this inheritance, his share passes to his children, or in the absence of children, to my own descendants, with the understanding that this establishment was built on brotherhood and should remain in the family that gave it life. "He left you half," Maggie breathed. "Even after you left, he never changed it. Not really." Thomas nodded. "The lawyer, Pritchard, he tracked me down about 5 years ago. Took him 3 decades, but he was thorough. Said Jack had paid him a retainer before he died. Asked him to keep looking even after Jack was gone." His voice cracked. "Said Jack wanted me to know I'd always had a home to come back to." Mrs. Kowalski made a small sound from her booth, something between a sob and a sigh. Hank Miller had removed his cap and was holding it against his chest, like they were at a funeral. In a way, Maggie supposed they were. "Why didn't you come back then?" The question wasn't accusatory, just exhausted. 5 years ago, when you found out. Why wait until now?" Thomas looked down at his hands, Shame, mostly. Fear. The longer you stay away, the harder it gets to imagine you deserve to return. I'd convinced myself that Jack had built a good life in spite of me, not because of me. That showing up would just reopen old wounds. He met her eyes. And then 6 months ago, a doctor in Harrisburg told me I had maybe a year left. Stage 4 lung cancer. All those cigarettes finally caught up with me. The revelation should have shocked her, but somehow it didn't. Looking at Thomas now, she could see it. The gray cast to his skin, the way his shirt hung loose despite the layers beneath it, the persistent tremor that spoke of a body slowly betraying itself. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "Don't be. I've had more time than I deserved." Thomas pushed the will toward her. "This belongs to you now. Legally, it supersedes the later will because it was never officially revoked." Pritchard confirmed it. "The diner is half yours by inheritance through Jack, and half mine by the same route. Which means," he took a shaky breath, "which means we're partners, you and me, if you'll have me." Maggie's mind was reeling. The diner had been struggling for months. Rising food costs, fewer customers as the new highway pulled traffic away from downtown, a roof that needed replacing before winter. She'd been considering selling, moving to Pittsburgh to be near her mother, starting over somewhere that didn't feel like it was built on the bones of better days. But looking at Thomas now, at this man who was technically a stranger, but who had her grandfather's eyes and her mother's stubborn jaw, she felt something shift, a door opening, a second chance. "There's a catch, isn't there?" she asked, because there was always a catch. Thomas smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his face entirely. For just a moment, she could see the boy from the photograph, the one who'd stood beside his brother and believed the future was something they could build together. "I want to work," he said. "However long I've got left. Could be 6 months, could be a year. I want to spend it here. Washing dishes, mopping floors, whatever you need. I want to be useful. I want to..." His voice broke. "I want to be part of something again." Luis had abandoned all pretense of work and was now openly crying into his dish towel. Hank Miller was nodding like a preacher listening to a particularly good sermon. And Mrs. Kowalski, tough old Mrs. Kowalski who'd buried 2 husbands and never shed a tear in public, was dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. Maggie thought about the photograph behind the register, about all the years her grandfather had kept it there, a shrine to a hope that never died, about the letters written and undelivered, the searches that came up empty, the way Jack Callahan had built something beautiful out of heartbreak and still left room for his brother to come home. She thought about the girl she'd been at 16, taking her first orders with shaking hands because her grandfather believed she could do it. About the nights she'd worked double shifts to keep the doors open after he died. About the way this place, this worn-down, struggling, beautiful place, had saved her as much as she'd saved it. "Okay," she said. Thomas blinked. "Okay? You can work here. We're partners." She held out her hand across the table, feeling the weight of 30 years of absence and a lifetime of what-ifs pressing down on the gesture. "Welcome home, Uncle Tommy." His hand was rough and scarred when it closed around hers, but his grip was strong. And for the first time in 3 decades, Thomas Callahan allowed himself to believe he might deserve a second chance after all. But what neither of them knew yet was that the diner held its own secrets, ones that would surface in ways neither could predict. Thomas Callahan started work the next morning at 6, an hour before the diner officially opened. Because some debts can only be repaid one dish at a time, one clean floor at a time, one sunrise at a time. Maggie had arrived to find him already there, sitting on the front steps in the pre-dawn cold, with his hands wrapped around a thermos of coffee. He'd changed clothes, still worn, but clean, and his hair was combed back with water. He looked like a man reporting for the first day of a job he couldn't afford to lose. "You don't have a key yet," Maggie said, unlocking the door. "Didn't want to presume." Inside, the diner smelled like it always did in the early morning. Lemon cleaner and coffee grounds and the ghost of yesterday's bacon grease. Maggie flipped on the lights, and the fluorescent tubes stuttered to life with their familiar electric hum. Thomas stood in the doorway like he was entering a church, his eyes traveling over every detail. The worn countertop, the coffee maker that had been temperamental since 1965, the photograph behind the register. He moved toward it slowly, reaching out to touch the frame with fingers that trembled. "I remember the day this was taken," he said softly. Pop had just signed the lease. Jack was so excited he could barely sleep the night before. Kept shaking me awake to talk about the menu, what we'd serve, how we'd arrange the tables. He smiled at the memory. "We must have rearranged this place 20 times before we ever served a single customer." Maggie started the coffee, the ritual grounding her. He never changed much after that. Said once you got something right, there was no sense messing with it. Sounds like Jack. They worked in comfortable silence for a while. Thomas washing dishes from yesterday that Luis had left to soak. Maggie prepping the register and setting up the dining room. It wasn't until she was refilling napkin dispensers that she noticed Thomas had stopped working and was staring at something behind the kitchen. "That door," he said. "It used to lead to the basement storage, didn't it?" Maggie followed his gaze to the narrow door tucked beside the walk-in cooler. It was painted the same industrial white as the walls, easy to overlook if you didn't know it was there. A heavy padlock secured it, and had for as long as Maggie could remember. Still does, I think. I've never been down there. Grandpa kept it locked. Always? Thomas's voice had gone strange, distant. As long as I've worked here. He said the stairs were rotten, that it was dangerous. We store everything up here now. She studied his face. Why? Thomas set down the dish he'd been holding with deliberate care. Because that's where Jack and I used to hide when we were kids. Before the diner, when it was still Pop's garage. We'd sneak down there and read comic books by flashlight, tell stories, plan out our futures. He moved closer to the door, his expression unreadable. Jack built this place on top of our childhood. I never thought about what that meant until now. Something in his tone made Maggie's skin prickle. What do you mean? Can I see it? The basement? Tommy? If the stairs are bad? I need to see it. The urgency in his voice was startling. Please, Maggie. I can't explain why, but I need to know what's down there. She should have said no. Should have reminded him about the structural concerns, the liability issues, the simple fact that some doors stayed locked for good reasons. But looking at her uncle's face, at the desperate need written there, she found herself reaching for the key ring her grandfather had left her. There were dozens of keys, most of them mysteries. She'd tried a few doors around town in the months after he died, attempting to decode his system, but had given up when nothing made sense. Now she sorted through them, looking for something that might fit a basement padlock. The third key she tried slid home with a click that sounded too loud in the quiet kitchen. The padlock fell open. The door swung inward on hinges that shrieked with disuse. A smell rolled out. Not decay exactly, but age. Dust and concrete and something else that Maggie couldn't identify. Something that made her think of closed spaces and held breath. Thomas found a light switch just inside the doorframe. A single bulb flickered to life below, casting weak yellow light down a set of wooden stairs that did indeed look questionable. "Let me go first," Maggie said. But Thomas was already descending, his feet finding each step with the confidence of muscle memory decades old. She followed, her hand on the railing, which wobbled alarmingly, her heart hammering against her ribs for reasons she couldn't name. The stairs creaked under their combined weight, and she found herself counting them. 12 steps down into a space that felt like it belonged to a different era entirely. The basement was smaller than she'd expected, maybe 20 feet square, with a low ceiling that made even her duck slightly. Concrete walls, a dirt floor packed hard by time, and in the corner, Maggie stopped breathing. A small table, 2 chairs, a kerosene lamp, long dry, and covering every inch of wall space. Drawings. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, tacked up with nails and pins, and in some places just pressed into cracks in the concrete. Children's drawings, crayon and pencil and what might have been charcoal. Pictures of buildings, of people, of a diner with 2 boys standing in front of it, arms around each other's shoulders. The same image, over and over, drawn by different hands, or maybe the same hand, at different ages. "Oh my God," Maggie whispered. Thomas moved through the space like a sleepwalker, his fingers brushing the drawings with reverent care. "We did this," he said, his voice thick. "Jack and I. Every time we had a new idea for the diner, we'd draw it. We were going to cover the whole basement, make it like a shrine to our dreams." He stopped in front of one particular drawing, more detailed than the others, showing the diner's layout almost exactly as it existed upstairs. This was Jack's. He drew it the week before I enlisted. Maggie moved closer, studying the careful lines, the way even as a teenager her grandfather had understood proportion and space. In the corner of the drawing, in her grandfather's distinctive handwriting, "For Tommy, when you come home." The words hit like a fist to the chest. "He kept coming down here," Thomas said, more to himself than to Maggie. "Even after I left. That's why the door was locked. He was protecting this, protecting us." He turned, and his face was wet with tears. "All those years, he kept our dream alive down here where nobody could see it, where it was safe." Maggie understood then why her grandfather had never spoken about the basement, why he'd kept it locked and forbidden. It wasn't about rotten stairs or storage concerns. It was about grief too raw to expose to daylight. This space was where Jack Callahan had kept his hope alive, had maintained a conversation with a brother who might never answer. A shrine to a partnership that ended too soon. "There's something else," Thomas said, pointing to the far corner. Maggie followed his gaze and saw it. A wooden crate, the kind that might have held tools or supplies. Thomas knelt beside it, lifting the lid with hands that shook so badly he nearly dropped it. Inside were letters. Hundreds of them, bundled with string, each one addressed in her grandfather's handwriting to Thomas Callahan, General Delivery, various locations. All returned, all unopened. "He never stopped writing," Maggie said, her voice breaking. "No," Thomas agreed, picking up one bundle and holding it against his chest, like it might keep his heart from shattering completely. "He never did." And in that moment, in that small basement beneath a struggling diner in Pennsylvania, 2 people who'd been strangers 24 hours ago held each other and wept for all the years that couldn't be recovered. But upstairs, the morning customers were starting to arrive. By 7:30, The breakfast crowd had filled every booth and most of the counter seats. Because life doesn't pause for grief, it just makes room for it between orders of eggs and toast. Maggie had left Thomas in the basement for a few minutes to compose himself, promising to return. But when she'd climbed those rickety stairs and locked the door behind her, the diner was already filling with the people who came every morning. Postal workers on their route, construction crews before the job site, retirees who had nowhere else to be and liked the company. She tied on her apron, grabbed her order pad, and slipped into the rhythm that had sustained her through her grandfather's death, through her mother's departure, through every hard morning that had come before this one. "Coffee, Maggie, black as sin," called out Bernard Tate, who drove the school bus and always sat in booth 3. "2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, no butter," added Carol Winters, the librarian, who hadn't varied her order in 5 years. Luis was already working the grill, his spatula moving in practiced patterns. He glanced at Maggie with a question in his eyes. "Is he okay down there?" And she nodded, though she wasn't sure it was true. The door chimed. More customers. The Hendersons with their daughter Annie, who was maybe 7 and always ordered chocolate chip pancakes. Frank Morrison, who owned the hardware store and read the paper while he ate. The diner swelled with conversation, with the clatter of silverware, with the hiss of bacon on the griddle. Normal life. Continuing. Maggie was refilling coffee when the basement door opened and Thomas emerged. He'd washed his face, composed himself, but his eyes were still red-rimmed. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, taking in the full diner, the organized chaos, the life that Jack Callahan had built, and that somehow still persisted. Then he picked up a dish towel and got to work. "Who's the new guy?" Bernard called out, never one for subtlety. Maggie met Thomas's eyes across the kitchen. He gave a small nod. "It's okay, tell them." "This is Thomas Callahan," she announced, her voice carrying over the diner's noise. "My grandfather's brother. He's going to be working here." The diner went quiet. Not silent. The radio still played, the coffee maker still burbled, but conversation stopped. Everyone in that room had known Jack Callahan. Most had eaten at his diner for decades, and while the younger customers might not remember, the older ones, Bernard, Carol, Frank, Mrs. Kowalski, who'd come in for her morning tea, they knew about the brother who'd disappeared. "Well, I'll be damned," Bernard said finally. "Thought you were dead, if I'm being honest." "So did I for a while," Thomas replied. Frank Morrison folded his newspaper deliberately, studying Thomas with the careful assessment of someone who'd known Jack Callahan well. "You look like him, around the eyes." He was the better-looking one. A few people chuckled, and just like that, the tension broke. Conversation resumed. Orders kept coming. And Thomas Callahan began washing dishes in the diner his brother had built, tears mixing with dish soap as he scrubbed plates that had fed this community for 30 years. Little Annie Henderson slipped away from her parents' booth and appeared beside Maggie at the coffee station. She was small for 7, with dark curls and serious brown eyes that seemed too old for her face. "Is that man sad?" she asked quietly. Maggie knelt down to Annie's level. "Yeah, sweetheart. He is." "Because of something that happened a long time ago?" "Something like that." Annie considered this with the gravity children bring to important matters. Then she walked into the kitchen, Luis making a half-hearted attempt to redirect her that she ignored completely, and tugged on Thomas's sleeve. He looked down, surprised. "My grandpa died last year," Annie said. "Mom says it's okay to be sad about people even if you didn't see them in a long time. She says love doesn't have an expiration date." Thomas's composure, so carefully rebuilt, crumbled. He set down the plate he was holding and sank to one knee so he was eye level with this small person who just offered him more grace than he'd given himself in 30 years. "Your mom is very wise," he managed. "Do you want a hug? Hugs help sometimes." Thomas nodded, unable to speak, and this child he'd never met wrapped her small arms around his neck and held on tight. Over Annie's shoulder, Maggie saw her own grief reflected in her uncle's face. All the years of running, all the chances missed, all the love that had waited patiently for him to believe he deserved it. The breakfast rush continued around them. Luis flipped pancakes. Maggie poured coffee. The register chimed. And in the middle of it all, a broken man received comfort from a child who understood that some wounds never fully heal, but could still be tended with kindness. When Annie returned to her parents' booth, Thomas stood slowly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He caught Maggie's gaze and mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." She nodded, her own throat too tight for speech. The morning wore on. By 9 o'clock, the rush had thinned to stragglers. Thomas had worked steadily, learning the kitchen's rhythms, falling into step with Luis like they'd been working together for years. And when Carol Winters left a $5 bill on the counter for a $3 meal, telling Maggie to give the change to that brave man in the kitchen, Thomas had to excuse himself to the alley behind the diner to cry where the customers couldn't see. But he came back. He always came back. At 10:15, a black sedan pulled up outside. Newer than most cars that stopped at Callahan's, cleaner, official-looking. A woman in a gray suit emerged, carrying a briefcase. She entered the diner and scanned the room with professional efficiency until her eyes landed on Maggie. "Margaret Brennan?" she asked. Maggie's stomach dropped. "That's me." The woman pulled out a business card. "I'm Jennifer Halloway, with the Pennsylvania Department of Revenue. I need to speak with you about some irregularities in your business tax filings." And just like that, the fragile peace shattered. Because the past never stays buried as neatly as we hope. Jennifer Halloway didn't sit down when Maggie offered her a booth. She stood near the register like someone who'd learned never to get comfortable. Because some people arrive not to join your world, but to dismantle it, piece by careful piece. "I can explain whatever irregularities you found," Maggie began, her hands already cold despite the warmth from the kitchen. "We've had some cash flow issues, and I might have filed the quarterly estimates late a few times, but this isn't about late filings." Halloway opened her briefcase and withdrew a folder thick with documents. "We've been conducting an audit of small businesses in the county, cross-referencing reported income with bank deposits. Your establishment showed significant discrepancies." The diner had emptied except for Mrs. Kowalski, who made no pretense of leaving, and Frank Morrison, who'd moved to a closer booth. Thomas emerged from the kitchen, dish towel still in hand, his expression guarded. "What kind of discrepancies?" Maggie asked, though part of her already knew. Part of her had known for 3 years, since she'd taken over the books after her grandfather died, and found things that didn't quite add up. Halloway spread several pages across the counter. Bank statements, deposit slips, all marked with yellow highlighter. Between 1968 and 1971, this diner reported annual revenues between $18,000 and $22,000. But the bank records show deposits averaging $35,000 to $40,000 annually. She looked up. "That's nearly double what was declared. We're talking about potential tax evasion spanning multiple years." The words hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire. "That's impossible," Maggie said, but her voice lacked conviction. She'd seen those numbers herself, had spent nights trying to reconcile them, had eventually given up and assumed her grandfather had simply been bad at paperwork. My grandfather would never. Your grandfather is deceased, which complicates matters. Holloway's tone wasn't unkind, just relentlessly factual. But you've been operating the business for 3 years. You're responsible for any ongoing violations and potentially liable for back taxes on the unreported income. Thomas moved closer, his presence solid beside Maggie. How much are we talking about? With penalties and interest, approximately $47,000. The number hit like a physical blow. Maggie grabbed the counter to steady herself. 47,000. She had maybe 3,000 in the business account, another 2 in personal savings. The diner barely cleared enough each month to cover expenses and her modest salary. I don't have that kind of money, she whispered. Then we'll need to discuss payment plans. Or. Holloway paused, her expression shifting to something that might have been sympathy. Or liquidation of assets. The building and property would likely cover the debt. Sell the diner. The words Maggie had been considering for months, but coming from this stranger's mouth, they sounded like a death sentence. There has to be another explanation, Thomas said. His voice was steady, but Maggie could see the tremor in his hands had worsened. Jack Callahan was the most honest man I ever knew. He wouldn't cheat on his taxes. I'm not making accusations about character, Mr. Callahan. Thomas Callahan. Jack was my brother. Holloway's eyebrows rose slightly. I see. Well, Mr. Callahan, the numbers don't lie. Someone was depositing significantly more money than was being reported to the state. Frank Morrison cleared his throat from his booth. Jennifer, we went to high school together, if you remember. I've been coming to this diner since it opened. Jack Callahan ran an honest business. I'm sure he did, Frank. But honest businesses still have to follow tax law. Mrs. Kowalski stood up, all 4 feet 11 inches of her bristling with indignation. That man gave half his profits to families who couldn't pay. During the coal strike in '69, he fed strikers for free. You want to know where the extra money went? It went right back out the door to people who needed it. Maggie's breath caught. She thought about the basement, about the drawings, about the letters her grandfather had written to a brother who never received them. About a man who'd built something beautiful and then protected it fiercely, who'd held on to hope for 30 years because letting go would have meant admitting defeat. The ledgers, she said suddenly. Grandpa kept personal ledgers separate from the official books. They're in his office. I never looked at them because I didn't understand his system. May I see them? Holloway asked. The office was barely more than a closet behind the kitchen, a desk, a filing cabinet, and walls covered with photos of customers and community events. Maggie pulled open the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet and withdrew 3 leather-bound ledgers, their pages yellowed and filled with her grandfather's meticulous handwriting. Holloway opened the first one, dated 1968. Her finger traced down columns of numbers, notations, names. Maggie looked over her shoulder and finally understood what she was seeing. Henderson family, breakfast $3.50, comp, medical bills. Kowalski, soup and sandwich $2.25, comp, husband's funeral. Miller family of 6, dinner $18 ounces, comp. House fire. Page after page, year after year. Meals served and immediately written off, marked with careful notes about why. Medical emergencies, job losses, deaths, the endless small tragedies that befell working families in a small Pennsylvania town. He was giving it away, Thomas said softly, reading over Maggie's other shoulder. All the extra revenue. He was feeding people who couldn't pay. Holloway turned pages in silence, her professional mask slipping slightly. The ledgers painted a picture of a man who'd used his business as a tool for community care, who'd reported only what he legally had to while quietly subsidizing his neighbor's survival. This still doesn't account for the tax liability, Holloway said finally. Charitable giving has to be documented properly, claimed as deductions. He didn't want deductions, Mrs. Kowalski interrupted. He wanted privacy for people who were already ashamed of needing help. Maggie thought about Annie Henderson's chocolate chip pancakes, about how the family never seemed to pay full price, about Bernard Tate, who'd lost his wife to cancer 5 years ago, and whose breakfast bills always seemed lighter than they should be, about Carol Winters, who lived on a librarian's salary and somehow always had enough for lunch. Her grandfather had built a system of grace into his business model, hidden it in the books, and protected it until his death. "I'll need to take these ledgers," Holloway said. "Submit them as evidence. It might help reduce the penalties if we can demonstrate charitable intent, but—" She stopped, studying Maggie's face. "But it's still a significant debt, and the state will want it settled." The door chimed. More customers for the lunch rush. 3 construction workers from the highway project, looking for coffee and sandwiches. Life continuing, oblivious to the crisis unfolding. Maggie took a breath, made a decision. "How long do I have?" 30 days to respond to the assessment. After that, we begin collection proceedings. 30 days to save a diner that had been feeding this community for 3 decades. 30 days to honor her grandfather's legacy without destroying it in the process. 30 days to prove that some things were worth fighting for. By noon, word had spread through town like wildfire through dry grass. Because in small towns, crisis is never a private matter. It becomes everyone's story to carry or everyone's shame to share. Maggie had tried to continue the lunch service as if nothing had changed, as if she hadn't just learned that the diner might be gone within a month. But her hands shook when she poured coffee, and she forgot orders she'd taken 100 times before. Thomas worked beside her in grim silence, and Luis moved through the kitchen with the heavy tread of someone attending a wake. Jennifer Holloway had left with the ledgers, promising to file a report that might reduce the penalties. But even reduced, the numbers were impossible. Maggie had done the math on a napkin during a quiet moment. If she sold everything she owned, worked triple shifts, stopped paying herself entirely, she might raise $10,000. Nowhere near enough. At 12:30, Bernard Tate walked in with his wife, Ruth. Then came the Hendersons, all 3 of them, including Annie. Frank Morrison returned with his brother Donald, who owned the feed store. Carol Winters arrived with her sister. Mrs. Kowalski brought her son, Michael, who Maggie hadn't seen in years. Within 20 minutes, the diner was packed beyond capacity. "We heard," Bernard said simply, standing at the counter, "about the tax situation." Maggie's throat tightened. "I don't know how—" "Frank's wife works at the county office," Bernard continued. "Word travels, and we've been talking." Ruth Tate stepped forward, placing an envelope on the counter. "There's $800 in there. It's what we've been saving for a new refrigerator, but this is more important." "I can't accept—" "You can, and you will," Ruth said firmly. "Your grandfather fed Bernard for free for 6 months, after he had his heart attack and couldn't work. We owe this family more than money can measure." More envelopes appeared. Frank Morrison's held $500. The Hendersons contained $200. An enormous sum for a family of 4 living on a single income. Carol Winters contributed $300. Her sister, another $100. Mrs. Kowalski's envelope was thin, but held two crisp $50 bills that Maggie knew represented the woman's entire monthly discretionary budget. "Stop," Maggie said, tears streaming down her face. "Please, I can't take your savings." "Jack Callahan saved this town more times than we can count," Michael Kowalski said. His voice was rough with emotion. When the mine closed in '66, he hired 3 laid-off miners to help renovate this place. Work they didn't need done, but he created it anyway. My father was one of them. That job kept our family afloat until Dad found new work. Annie Henderson approached the counter, holding a plastic sandwich bag filled with coins. "This is my piggy bank," she announced. "It's $14.37. I was saving for a bicycle, but Mr. Jack would have wanted me to help Miss Maggie." The dam broke. Maggie sobbed openly, and Thomas put his arm around her shoulders. This man she'd known for barely 24 hours, but who felt like family in the way that mattered most. "We're not going to let them take this place," Bernard declared. "Jack Callahan built more than a diner here. He built a community, and communities take care of their own." By 2 o'clock, the counter was covered with envelopes and cash and checks written on shaking hands. Luis had stopped even pretending to work and was crying into his apron. Thomas counted silently, his lips moving, his expression growing more stunned with each addition. $11,437, he announced finally, in less than 2 hours. "It's not enough," Maggie said, though the gratitude nearly choked her. "It's incredible, but it's not enough." "Then we do more," Frank Morrison said. "We hold a fundraiser, get the story in the newspaper, the radio station. People beyond this town need to know what Jack Callahan built here, what he represented." "I can write the article," Carol Winters offered. "The Gazette owes me a favor." "The VFW Hall," Bernard's wife Ruth added. "We can hold a dinner. Charge $20 a plate, get every veteran in the county to come. Jack served in World War II. The military community will show up." Thomas had gone very still, his eyes fixed on the pile of money representing a community's love for his brother. "He knew," he whispered. "Jack knew this is what would happen. That's why he gave so much away. Because he understood that kindness compounds. That what you give comes back when you need it most." Maggie thought about the basement, about the drawings that mapped out more than just a diner's floor plan. They'd been blueprints for a different kind of architecture, one built on trust and generosity and the quiet certainty that taking care of people was its own reward. "There's something else," Thomas said suddenly. "The will, the original one that Pritchard found. It established equal partnership between Jack and me, which means," he turned to Maggie, "which means I'm half owner of this property, and I can leverage my half." "Tommy, you don't have any money." "No, but I have life insurance, $60,000. I took out the policy years ago, when I was trying to convince myself I'd eventually have someone to leave it to." His voice steadied with conviction. "If I sign it over as collateral, the bank might give us a bridge loan until we can raise the rest through fundraising." "You can't do that. That insurance is for—" Maggie stopped, the reality settling over her. "That's for your funeral, for when I'm gone, which won't be long regardless." Thomas took her hands. "Let me do this. Let me help save what Jack built. It's the only inheritance I have to give, and I can't think of a better way to use it." The diner had gone silent. Everyone, listening to this man offer up his last possession to save a place he'd abandoned 30 years ago. "That's the most Callahan thing I've ever heard," Frank Morrison said quietly. By evening, plans were in motion. Carol had called the Gazette and pitched the story. The VFW had offered their hall for a fundraiser dinner in 2 weeks. The local radio station agreed to run announcements, and Thomas had called the bank, setting up a meeting for the next morning to discuss the life insurance collateral. As the last customers filtered out and Maggie locked the door behind them, she stood in the empty diner and felt the weight of what had happened. Not just the money, though that was overwhelming, but the way this community had responded, instantly, generously, without hesitation. "He built something that mattered," Thomas said, appearing beside her. "So did you. You came back. That matters too." Thomas looked around the diner, at the photographs, the worn booths, the coffee maker that had witnessed 30 years of community life. "I spent so long thinking I'd destroyed everything by leaving. But maybe—" He paused, struggling for words. "Maybe coming back is the only part that really counts." Outside, the October night had turned cold, but inside Callahan's diner, surrounded by evidence of a community's love, Maggie felt warmer than she had in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, they'd proven that some legacies couldn't be erased by tax debts, or time, or even death itself. The fundraiser dinner filled the VFW hall 2 weeks later, with more people than the fire marshal would have approved. Because some stories demand to be witnessed, some debts demand to be honored, and some families are built plate by plate across decades of quiet grace. 347 people came. Veterans who'd served with Jack Callahan in the Pacific. Families he'd fed through hard times. Business owners he'd supported when banks wouldn't. People from 3 counties over who'd heard the story on the radio and wanted to be part of something that mattered. Carol Winters's article in the Gazette had run with the headline, "The diner that fed a community now needs feeding back." She'd interviewed 20 people, each with their own story of how Jack Callahan had helped them. The piece had been picked up by the Pittsburgh papers, then the Philadelphia Inquirer. By the time the fundraiser arrived, donations had come from as far as Ohio and New York. $5 here, 20 there. One envelope containing a $100 bill and a note that read simply, "For Jack." He would have done the same. Thomas had secured the bridge loan, putting his life insurance up as collateral. The bank officer, a woman named Patricia Chen, who remembered eating free lunches at Callahan's when her father had been laid off in the 60s, had approved it within 48 hours. Between the community donations, the fundraiser, and the loan, they'd raised $53,000. Enough to cover the tax debt with a small cushion left over for repairs. Now, standing at the front of the VFW hall with Maggie beside him, Thomas looked out at all these faces and felt the weight of 30 lost years pressing against his chest. "I don't deserve this," he'd told Maggie that morning, his hands shaking worse than usual as he'd buttoned his one decent shirt. "It's not about deserving," she'd replied. "It's about belonging. And you belong here whether you believe it or not." Bernard Tate stood to speak first, his voice carrying across the crowded hall. "Jack Callahan taught me something important, that a man's worth isn't measured by what he accumulates, but by what he gives away. Tonight, we're giving back to the legacy he built, and we're welcoming home the brother he never stopped waiting for." The applause was thunderous. One by one, people stood to share their stories. Ruth Tate talked about the meals that sustained them through Bernard's illness. Michael Kowalski described how his father had found dignity again through work Jack had created. The Hendersons spoke about breakfast bills that were always mysteriously lower than they should have been. And then Annie Henderson, 7 years old and fearless, walked to the front of the room carrying a large piece of poster board covered in drawings. "I made this for Mr. Thomas," she announced, "because he was sad about his brother, and art helps when you're sad." The poster showed Callahan's diner drawn in crayon, with two stick figures standing in front holding hands. Above them, in careful letters, "Brothers forever." Thomas knelt down as Annie approached, and when she handed him the drawing, something in his chest, something that had been frozen for 3 decades, finally cracked open. "Thank you," he whispered. "I'll treasure this." "Are you still sick?" Annie asked with the blunt honesty of children. "Yes, sweetheart, I am." "That's okay. Mom says that sick people can still do important things, and helping Miss Maggie is important." He hugged her then, this child who kept teaching him grace, and when he stood, his eyes found Maggie's across the room. She was crying too, surrounded by the community that had saved them both. The evening ended with a toast, raised glasses of sweet tea and coffee, because the VFW took their sobriety pledge seriously, and a promise that Callahan's diner would remain open for as long as anyone needed feeding. 3 months later, on a January morning when snow fell soft and silent over Pennsylvania, Thomas Callahan passed away in his sleep in the small apartment above the diner. He'd worked until 2 days before the end, washing dishes, greeting customers, telling stories about his brother to anyone who would listen. The hospice nurse said she'd never seen anyone hold on so fiercely to life, as if every moment mattered in a way it hadn't before. The funeral filled the diner to capacity and spilled out onto the sidewalk. Maggie, read from the original partnership agreement, her voice steady despite her grief. Louise spoke about redemption and second chances, and Annie Henderson, now 8 years old, placed a drawing beside Thomas's urn, 2 brothers reunited at last. In his will, Thomas left his half of the diner to Maggie with one condition: that booth 7, the corner booth where he'd sat that first October afternoon, would always be reserved for people who were lost and needed finding. Maggie honored that request. A small brass plaque was mounted on the table, the Tommy Callahan Memorial Booth, for those finding their way home. And sometimes, on quiet afternoons when the lunch rush has ended and the coffee pot is still warm, people swear they can see 2 figures in that booth, one older, one younger, bent over drawings spread across the table, planning futures they'll never see but believing in them anyway. The diner still stands. Maggie runs it with the same quiet generosity her grandfather taught her, and every morning she unlocks the basement door and goes down to look at the drawings that 2 boys made when they believed anything was possible. Some legacies live in buildings. Others live in the way we choose to feed each other. Both kinds matter. They say on certain October evenings when the light hits just right through the diner windows, you can still see a worn wallet resting on the counter, always in the same spot, always waiting for someone to claim it. If this story moved you, consider sharing it with someone who needs reminding that it's never too late to come home. And remember, the small acts of kindness you offer today might be the legacy someone fights to preserve tomorrow. Drop a comment telling us about a place in your community that feeds more than just bodies. We'd love to hear your stories.